The problem is that we incarcerate 1% of the adult population. 1% of the adult population. No other country incarcerates that many people. And so the book, it's called The Illusion of Free Markets, Punishment and the Myth of Natural Order in the Economic Sphere. And at the same time as they believed in natural order in the economic sphere, they also believed that the only place for the state really was to police and punish those who were, in some sense, unnatural, deregulated, out of order. And that this idea of, on the one hand, natural orderliness in the economic sphere with the need for policing, right, that these ideas were joined at the hip in the 18th century. And I traced this over the 19th century through Bentham's work, but to the 20th century with the idea of efficient markets. And you'll notice that the idea of efficient markets, again, an idea of natural orderliness in the efficient markets, is again, today, joined at the hip with the idea that the government has a legitimate and competence in the area of policing. And so you saw with the growth of neoliberalism in the 1970s, an exponential increase in incarceration rates in this country. For 50 years, from 1926 to 1973, basically, prison rates were constant. And then all of a sudden in 73, they start rising exponentially. And I mean exponentially. I mean, if you look at the curve, and the curve which I show in the book, in 1973, prison rates just start rising dramatically, right? And the logic that accompanied that rise, if you listen closely to the language of, say, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, or even Richard Nixon in the 1960s, late 1960, his 1968 acceptance speech, was this combination of, on the one hand, kind of, we have a bloated federal government, right, that we need to shrink, right? We need less government jobs, less government housing, less government programs, right? So we need to shrink that because the government is inefficient and incompetent at doing what it does, conjoined with the fact that we had to increase policing and punishing and have a more penal state, right? And it's that conjunction, it's that paradox of, on the one hand, the idea that the state is incompetent, right, with this other idea that the state is fully competent and legitimate in the penal sphere that I really explore in the book. You see it in Nixon's speeches in the 1960s and 1968. You see it in Reagan's speeches where he talks about, in some sense, he talks about the bloated federal government, right? And at the same time that he's talking about the bloating government and trying to shrink it, he's also talking about the fact that we need to do more policing, that we have to have more crime expenditure, more government intervention in the crime area. And it's this paradox that I develop in the book, Illusion of Free Markets. And what I try to argue is that, now, there were a lot of reasons why the prisons grew the way they grew in the 1970s and the 1980s. There was the war on drugs. Race plays an enormous role in this story, in racial profiling. And we've seen our prisons essentially go from approximately 1/3 persons of color at the beginning of the century to over 2/3 persons of color. So we've seen an exponential kind of racialization of the prison sphere. And what has, in some sense, facilitated this, made it possible, reduced our resistance to this carceralization in America, is the idea that the government is good in this one area, is efficient, is legitimate in this one area, which is criminalization and punishment. And so I argue that it's basically this, the illusion that there could be an unregulated space. It's the illusion of free markets, the idea that there could be an unregulated space that allows us to think that the government has a role in policing and that allows the penal sphere to increase so much. Now, in the book, I try to demonstrate that the idea of the free market is itself an illusory idea. That there is no such thing as an unregulated space. The example I use is the Chicago Board of Trade, which we conventionally look at the Chicago Board of Trade as the space of the free market, where we think there are free, voluntary exchanges going on. And it turns out that when you look at that, the wheat pit, right, where there are free exchanges going on, it might look free when you're looking at the exchanges right there for a second, but it requires an intricate regulatory mechanism to make that space possible. Right? In other words, the Chicago Board of Trade itself was only made possible by the fact that we criminalized what were called bucket shops in the 19th century, which were places where we engaged in the trade of futures, of wheat contracts, etc. But those bucket shops weren't the place that we wanted to have this free space of exchange, in part because the bucket shops were run by more lowly figures, right? And there was a certain prestige and expense to become a member of the Chicago Board of Trade. The Chicago Board of Trade could not have continued to exist without criminalizing, eliminating all of the bucket shops that existed in Chicago. And they did, successfully. And then the Chicago Board of Trade became the place where we traded wheat futures, pork bellies, etc. But even there, when you look at it, it's truffled with regulation. So in the book, I look specifically at kind of time of trade regulation. Particularly, what happens is if anybody trades after the closing, then there are complicated mechanisms about modified closing calls and all of these things that actually fix the price of the commodity for the exchange at that point. And what's clear from all these regulations is that it's ultimately an extremely regulated space. We tend to think of it, we characterize it as the free market, but in fact it's a fully regulated space. And it's this myth that we can actually have, on the one hand, these non-regulated spaces that allows us to then think that the government's role, the government's legitimate role, is in these places of punishment and policing that result in ultimately what we have today, which is, you know, a carceral state, essentially. The privatization of prisons kind of plays into this logic in a very interesting way. Today, approximately 8% of prisoners in the United States are actually incarcerated in private prisons. The rate is going to go up significantly in the next couple of years because of the budget crisis and the fact that, for instance, Arizona is trying to essentially sell its entire correctional system to the private market. So the numbers are going to go up, and there's no doubt that the privatization of prisons has, in some sense, facilitated the growth of the carceral sphere. And, you know, not just the privatization of prisons, but also, naturally, the way in which the prison complex today provides an economy. We've seen this in New York right now, where there are discussions about closing prisons, and you've heard the counties in the north part of New York fighting against the closure of prisons because these prisons, in some sense, are the economy of the county. It's the only thing that's left. And these aren't even privatized. And these aren't even privatized, right? So, I mean, the privatization is in some sense important and a piece of it, but it's relatively a small piece of it because, I mean, what we've got is essentially an economy that depends on this kind of incarceration, right? I mean, we've got an economy that in some parts of the country where essentially all of the economic activity, all of the employment is somehow related to incarcerating people. There's no question that we need some federal leadership right now, particularly in the area of incarceration. What's really interesting is that in 1963, John F. Kennedy provided true leadership on the issue of institutionalization. It's fascinating. I talk about this in the book, and I talk about this in some of my other work on deinstitutionalization, but the rates of institutionalization in the 1960s were practically identical to the rates of institutionalization in prisons today, right? So in the 1960s, actually 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, we used to institutionalize people in mental hospitals at about the same rate as we do today in prisons. Now, we saw a period of deinstitutionalization in the 1960s. It was brought about by a number of factors, but one of the most important factors was actually, interestingly, Medicaid and the Community Mental Health Act, which what it did was it provided a source of funding for states to use to get federal money to place mental health patients into outpatient community centers, right? And so if you look at that, I mean, it's fascinating because that's a place where we saw government intervention in a fully regulatory space shift populations away from detention in a mental hospital to outpatient mental health facilities. It would be very simple to do the same thing today. It would be very simple to have some federal leadership that would provide some federal dollars to actually shift people away from state incarceration and put them into out-treatment programs, community-based out-treatment programs that would significantly reduce the prison population. But again, what you need is some federal leadership. We saw it in '63 with John F. Kennedy, and it's something that we would need to see today. Now, the major resistance to that, of course, is going to be this idea that the federal government shouldn't be involved in regulating this area, which is, in essence, the idea, the myth of kind of free markets, that we don't want the government engaged in this area because that's not where the government's competence lies. So again, it's in kind of eliminating that illusory idea and facing the fact that there's government regulation everywhere. So the only question is how to regulate and what are the distributional consequences that we could possibly see some path towards some change. It seems as if the best evidence suggests that about 25% to 1/3 of the prison growth that we've seen during the 1980s and 1990s was attributable to the war on drugs. So not the whole thing, but a significant portion of it was attributable to the war on drugs. And you know, this goes across the board, but it covers everything from, you know, marijuana possession all the way to trafficking in heavier kind of drugs. What's fascinating is if you look at New York City, and I actually wrote an article about this called Reefer Madness. New York City police have been cracking down on what it's called MPV, marijuana in public view, as a quality of life offense, essentially. And so historically, for about 20 years, when you look at the numbers, for about 20 years, there were approximately 1,000 arrests for marijuana in public view, MPV. Starting with Giuliani in the 1990s, going towards 2000, the number goes up from 1,000 a year to 52,000 arrests. 52,000 arrests in New York City. So New York City becomes, in some sense, the absolute capital, right, of marijuana arrests in the state of New York. These, if I recall correctly, I don't have all the numbers at my fingertips, but this was a fascinating study because it was something like 92%, I think this was right, it was 92% of arrests for marijuana in public view in the state of New York, okay, were happening in the 5 boroughs in the city of New York. And this is a study I published in about 2006 with an economist, Jens Ludwig, and it's called Reefer Madness. It's really interesting. But what we try to show is actually there's no connection with crime drops, right? So the claim, of course, is that these are the kind of arrests that are helping us detect a lot of, I don't know what. But the claim is that these are this kind of quality of life policing is somehow going to reduce crime, serious crime. I mean, it's part of the whole broken windows myth, which is total myth. That in some sense, small disorder like marijuana in public view causes major crime. So the article actually takes this on. It's a statistical analysis of kind of marijuana arrests in New York, marijuana misdemeanor arrests in New York versus crime in the different precincts, and it dismantles the argument. I mean, it shows pretty clearly that there's no causal relationship between these marijuana arrests and a crime. I don't have the most recent numbers. I do know that the stop and frisks in New York have gone, through the roof in 2009, 2010. So we were talking about, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, we're talking about approximately 600,000 stop and frisks in New York a year. So Jeff Fagan has done some really good work. Jeff Fagan at Columbia has done some really good work on that. And the numbers have really shot up so it's under Bloomberg. Of course, the rationale there, right, is that by means of these stop and frisks, we get leads, we get information, we get a police state, is what you get. I mean, my first book was called Illusion of Order, The False Promise of Broken Windows Policing, which was essentially a critique of the Giuliani Quality of Life Initiative and of the broken windows theory. And what's pretty clear is that the increase in misdemeanors was in fact simply kind of a form of enhanced surveillance, which is going to have some effects on crime. I mean, there's no doubt that, a police state tends to be better at policing crime. The idea, though, the underlying idea that it would be disorderliness that is actually causing crime, completely specious. Completely specious. There's no good evidence to suggest that actually minor disorder causes major crime. I had a Danish prison researcher come to one of my courses recently and kind of show the architecture and geography of a Danish prison. And it was radically different than American prisons. I think that there's no doubt that part of the prison experience that we try to kind of create in the United States involves a certain form of violence. It might involve forms of sexual assault, violence, kind of a certain kind of cattle herding violence, racialized violence, gang violence, etc. That we, that we condone, that we accept. that we're willing to live with, in part because no one really wants to know what's going on there. I mean, spending time visiting a prison is I take my students to prison in my course every year, and it's really we walk out and my students are in some sense traumatized by the experience. They see the tip of the iceberg, right? The tip of the iceberg. And yet they come out and are changed, really. Before I went to graduate school, I was actually an attorney, and I'm actually from Manhattan, but I moved down to Alabama and represented folks on death row for 4 years, and continued. I still represent folks on death row. One of the most, I mean, there were many shocking things about the kind of work I was doing, but one of the most shocking things would be when they would call kind of ordinary cases. Of course, my cases weren't ordinary. My cases were, you know, death penalty cases, and we'd get a lot of time with the judge, but just in between arguing motions or selecting a jury, they'd kind of have the ordinary cases, and they would bring in, you know, 25, 30 guys to be processed. And it was usually, you know, 25 African-American young men, chained to each other in jumpsuits, chain around the waist, arms chained to the waist, chained on their, shackled on their legs, shackled to each other, and they'd kind of bring these guys in, usually on misdemeanor charges, you know, could be use of drugs, possession, you know, any kind of thing. Misdemeanors, small offenses. And they'd kind of line them up and bring them in front of the court, and they'd all kind of plead guilty and be processed. I remember sitting in these courtrooms and just thinking that it was as if the slave ship had just come into port, you know. And my sense is that that happens all the time, every day, in these small county courts. And no one pays attention, right? It's almost, I mean, I went down to represent folks on death row. It was 1990, so many years ago. A lot of my students weren't even born then. But it was still, 1990 was not that long ago, and it was many years after the civil rights movement. And somehow it seems as if the civil rights movement simply bypassed the criminal justice system. Right? We had some progress in the area well, we had some progress in the area of education. I suppose that residential resegregation has actually changed all that now. We have had some progress in the area of employment discrimination. But the one place that we have not seen any changes, it seems to me, is in the criminal justice system. And you can see it when you go into court today. And you know, I saw it when I went to court in Alabama. I saw it when I go into court in Chicago, in Cook County. It's not that different. You would think that you're basically observing some kind of antebellum auction.